featured speaker today, Dr. Edward Gordon, is an internationally known historian, author, and speaker. For over 20 years, he taught at DePaul University, Loyola, and Northwestern universities in Chicago. He's presented hundreds of historical programs across America to museums, universities, and libraries, and to a wide variety of organizations and associations. His record as a speaker here at the Air Museum dates back 20 years, so he's been with us a very long time, and thankfully for us. Dr. Gordon is an author of 20 books and over 150 articles in the areas of history, business, and education. A paperback edition of his Divided on D-Day will be coming out in the spring, and we do have copies of that here today, the hard copies, so you'll be able to grab those and get them signed today after the program. He's appeared on CBS Network's Early Show, CNN, PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many, many other media venues. He earned his BA and MA degrees in history at DePaul University, his PhD at Loyola, and pursued postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago, and he's here with us today, Dr. Edward Gordon. Thank you, Dr. Quinn.
Well, welcome to the only dry spot in the desert. Today I am dedicating this program to all of the people of the Ukraine who have struggled against tyranny for so many years in the 20th and now the 21st century. And we wish them well in their war against Russian aggression. Today we are going to talk about a hidden army, an army that maybe some of your relatives in Europe fought in the Second World War, the Shadow Army, European resistance during World War II. When the Nazis occupied Europe, they thought they would fight a rather rapid war and that it would end very quickly. Instead, what they discovered was the war dragged out for 6 years. And as a result, they were forced to fight the populations of Europe, who gradually became more and more full of hate for the brutal resistance of the Nazis. So here's our agenda today. First, we'll give you a general introduction as to what the resistance and the German response was all about. Then we'll talk about how the Germans tried to contain that resistance. And then the wide variety of Allied support for underground movements. And we'll divide this between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and there was quite a difference between the two. And we'll even talk about Italian resistance that occurred after Mussolini's regime fell and the Germans occupied Italy. And then the resistance that did occur in Germany during the time of the Third Reich. And finally, we'll try to give you an overview of how effective all of this resistance was and what it did to help win the war and the effect of Europe in post-war Europe. Between 1939 and 1941, the peoples of Europe were shaken, their foundations of their governments were destroyed with the very rapid German blitzkriegs, first in Western Europe and then in Eastern Europe. The legitimacy of democracy and of the way in which they had been governed, some by parliamentary rule, some by still the rule of monarchs, was overthrown by the Germans. Germany had no organized concept of how to rule Europe. Instead, various factions within the Nazi hierarchy attempted to assert control for varying reasons. Loot, the supremacy of German culture, and then the vicious destruction of Jews and anyone else in opposition to German rule. The early occupation of Western Europe was less harsh than by the end of the war. There had been widespread unemployment, The Depression in Europe was just as severe as it was in America. And there was general political dissatisfaction because we had fought the war to end all wars, and now we have another war. And pacifism. Many Europeans did not want to fight. We know about Munich and the whole idea of giving in to Hitler before the war. So all of these things really discouraged people joining resistance movements at the beginning of the occupation. And the other thing was, economic deals with the Germans helped to employ hundreds of thousands of Europeans now in armaments industries across Western Europe. So many of them got employment because actually they had lost the war. Well, the Germans, when they occupied particularly Western Europe, at first were on their good behavior. Here you see Germans in Paris bargaining for goods. Well, Paris, during the entire war, was a huge rest stop for the German army. Worn out German divisions would be sent to France to be rebuilt. And in Paris itself, even though the people were actually being starved to death, there was still a modicum of peace, because Paris was not bombed until toward the end of the war. However, the Germans issued prohibitions against demonstrations, curfews were set up, listening to the BBC was totally forbidden. Now, as the war continued, however, and the Germans were not prepared to fight a long war. The German army was not designed to fight a long war. The Luftwaffe did not have aircraft to fight a long war. They had no real strategic bombing as we did, bombers. They expected swift victories. So the longer the war went on, the more the Germans exploited all of the economies of Europe. 1/3 of all of the funds and supplies needed for the Germans to fight the war were taken from all these other countries. However, many of the civil servants of those countries cooperated with the Germans in order to maintain law and order. And also, their businesses cooperated with the Germans because, once again, it provided employment and it produced profits. At first, thousands of unemployed people across Europe volunteered to go to Germany and work in German armament. That changed as it was reduced gradually to slave labor. Later, hundreds of thousands would resist the German occupation, and that was mainly because Germany wasn't winning anymore. At first, people thought the Germans would win the war. France ultimately, because of the occupation, would see 50,000 killed and another 60,000 deported to Germany. Italy and Greece would suffer 100,000 killed during the war. And Eastern Europe would see hundreds of thousands, in the case of Russia, millions of people destroyed. But as the war lengthened, the hatred of Germans increased. However, you can see for the Germans, any attempt at resistance was terrorism, because now they saw themselves as the legitimate government of Europe. So they were fighting what they thought was terrorism. We have to remember that 1.5 million non-Germans volunteered to fight in the German army and the SS during the Second World War. 1 million of those were Russians, Ukrainians, Cossacks, Belarus, because they hated the communists. Hitler, however, botched it because he didn't offer them anything ultimately better than the communists did, didn't they? Did he? As the war lengthened, sabotage, like you see on the screen there, lengthened. Doubts of ultimate German victory. The population was starving to death as Germans took more and more food away from all of Europe to feed themselves and their war effort. And they the Germans had to deploy more security forces across Europe, though many of those security forces were collaborators who actually were part now of the German police or army or SS. This drained the combat forces for the German army, particularly on the Russian front, because as we will see in the East, resistance was from the beginning very significant. The German occupation was simple: terror. She shoots this German soldier, 10 people die. If it doesn't work, that German soldier dies, 100 people die. Indiscriminate terror. You've all heard about Stalin during the 30s, in order to maintain terror and control on the streets of Moscow, would just send his secret police and they just gather innocent people and send them off to the gulag. No one knew what might happen to them. This was just to maintain that idea of terror. Well, the Germans did the same thing. They would take all of you as hostage. And if something happened, they'd take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 and shoot you. That was very effective at the beginning of the war and the occupation of stopping people from participating in resistance, particularly in Western Europe. Whole towns in the East were destroyed. After Normandy, there was one instance of a town in France after the Normandy invasion in 1944, where the troops going through the town were shot at by some French, so they just took all the people, shot them all, and burned the town down to the ground. And now that town is a memorial. It still exists in the center of France as a memorial to German terrorism. So at first, those tactics worked to control civil populations and not participate in terrorist or in underground activities. Now, in Western Europe, the Allies' approach to the secret army was a combination of many different factors supplied by the different Allied nations. Here is the SOE. What was the SOE? Well, the SOE was the Secret Operations Executive. Churchill organized it. Here are some people from it. It was meant to set Europe ablaze. Remember, after Dunkirk, the British had no effective way of striking back at Germany, except from bombing, and their air force was very weak, particularly their bombers were very weak. So they were going to unleash terror, the concept of a detonation strategy, where they'd arm the people and they'd kill all these Germans and it would terrorize the Germans. So the problem with that strategy is just what I said. You kill 10 Germans, we'll shoot 500 people in your town. So the detonating strategy was not very good. Now, instead, the British supported espionage and underground resistance. The BBC had broadcasts to influence Europe's occupied people and give them hope that ultimately they would be liberated. And the BBC also sent coded messages to different underground groups. Here is a kit of what an espionage agent would use, a lightweight radio, weapons, plastic explosives, and of course the suicide pill if they were caught, because the Germans were very effective of breaking down everyone to give them information on networks by torture. Covertly, aircraft were used to drop agents and to help people escape from Western Europe. At the same time, extensive radio networks were set up in Britain. Here's one of the stations in England where they would send and receive agents' coded messages. Agents were also dropped by parachute, and they would be bringing in supplies, weapons, etc. One of the most effective operations was this, Operation Salesman, where the SOE in 1944 sank this one 900-ton German minesweeper in the harbor of Rouen by sinking it with 3 pounds of plastic explosive. Now, the U.S. invented their own resistance, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, established in 1942 by President Roosevelt. The OSS ultimately became the CIA. Here's the leader, Bill Donovan. He had 24,000 agents in Europe and Asia doing espionage work, commando, and other type of activity. Some of the agents, here they are, POWs, German and Jewish refugees, German diplomat. They penetrated into anti-Nazi organizations across Europe. Here is one of the radios they use, one of the most effective and lightweight radios used by all of them, the SOE and the Americans. And who used it? Well, here is one of the top agents. Now, who is this? Well, this too tall woman couldn't get into the wax, and she's pictured here. Julia Child. She worked for the OSS in China and later became a top secret researcher for the OSS. She was awarded the Emblem of Meritorious Civilian Service by the OSS before she became the world-famous chef. Of course, yet her cookbook did reveal the French chef's secrets. So now let's look at individual countries across Western Europe. What was going on? This is just an overview. I'm sure some of you want to know about a particular country. Come up afterwards and we'll talk about it. France, Belgium had a military government. Holland had an SS government. Large numbers of collaborators existed in Holland, as well as large numbers of Hollanders who protected Jews. Northern France, which was French-speaking, and Belgium were linked together and run by a military government. Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, was directly annexed into Germany. Let's look at France now. France was divided into 2 zones after the 6-week tragic defeat of the French army. The occupied zone in the south and the German zone and coastal zone for the rest of the country. The occupied zone in 1940, the unoccupied zone, the Vichy French government, was occupied in 1942 after the Allies landed in North Africa. The French state survived throughout the entire country. The civil service still operated. Initially, the people supported Pétain, who was the Vichy president of France after the surrender. But that greatly changed as time went on. Here is a picture of the German army in their victory parade in June of 1940. How many of you have seen that? Very, rather shattering picture, isn't it? 1941, disillusion began to spread across France as the war continued. There was no peace treaty. Remember, they signed an armistice with the Germans. The idea was that the Germans would leave because the war would end. Well, why? Well, was Britain not going to also fall to the Germans? Everyone believed that in France. Well, it didn't happen. What happened was the millions of men in the French army never returned. They were put in slave labor camps in Germany. And the Germans started deporting men to work in factories across France in Germany. And then finally, of course, the French Jews were being deported, and Pétain supported it with many Frenchmen. And his popularity began to wane. Well, here's part of the Marquis, the French resistance. It grew stronger year by year. French fascist collaborators, however, inflamed the hatred of the occupation and got more recruits for the resistance. Here is an interesting story. Ruth Hart was a German Jewish girl whose family fled to France after Hitler took over. Her father and uncle enlisted in the French Foreign Legion to help them become French citizens. When the Germans attacked, they fled to Vichy. The Vichy started helping the Germans to round up Jews across southern France. The parents hid in the woods, and the little girl was put into a Catholic orphanage. Across all of Europe, because of Pope Pius XII, Catholic orphanages, schools, hospitals, monasteries, convents took in people who were being hunted down, Jews and others. 900,000 Jews were saved during World War II because of this effort. This little girl, who became a French teacher in a university here in the United States, wrote this book. Her name originally was Ruth, but now the Mother Superior in the orphanage said, "Your name is now Renee." She, with 10 other little Jewish children, were hidden in that convent. And that convent, part of it, was SS headquarters for that region of France. The Germans would come periodically to check and see. And she would take these little children into a chapel, and there was something called a priest's hole, where the priests would hide during the French Revolution, because the French Revolution killed thousands of priests and nuns. And she put them in this hole, covered with a carpet before the altar, where they would hide until the SS left. She survived. This is her story. And now it's being turned into a play. And maybe it will be turned into a movie. I hope so. It's a very compelling movie. But this is the type of help that French people gave to Jews in France, while others turned them into the Germans. 320,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps. 25% of all the Jews in France were murdered. By 1943, 15 to 20,000 people were in the resistance, and it was again being enlarged more and more because of all of the young men that were being forced into slave labor in factories in Germany. Charles de Gaulle. Now, Charlie has an interesting history. Charlie was a colonel at the beginning of the war. He led one of the first and only French attacks by the French army of a tank corps to try to stop the German invasion, which worked for a short time. He then was appointed the Assistant Undersecretary for Defense by the government that was still fighting. When they were going to surrender, he was put on the hit list to be eliminated by the new Vichy government. He fled to England in an aircraft. There, on June 18th, 1940, he gave his famous call to honor speech, where he says, "The war is not lost. We must continue the war." It was the first of 67 broadcasts. Churchill strongly supported the efforts of the Free French. And this is the force of the FFI, Force Française de l'Intérieur. This was the resistance movement across France. It began organizing only slowly. Most of the French troops evacuated from Dunkirk, when they got to England, went right back to France. They did not support de Gaulle at the beginning, because again, the French thought that Britain would surrender. Well, the problem with the French resistance is, here you have a good picture of it. It was fractured. De Gaulle had the FFI, the British had the SOE, the Americans had the OSS, and Stalin had the French communists. And once Germany had attacked the Soviet Union, they too were involved in resistance. So this fractured the resistance movement across France. Now, June 1944, D-Day changed everything, because now the Allies were on French soil. There's a famous movie with Burt Lancaster about the effort to steal Nazi art and stop it. This is a scene from that movie. Sabotage increased dramatically after the Allies landed on June the 6th. And some leaders wanted to take the Germans on an open battle. But the Allies didn't want to see that happen because they were, again, afraid of massive retaliation. Now, in southern France, however, there was another invasion we launched on August 15th. And there, the resistance did openly challenge the German army. They derailed trains, they ambushed German supply columns, and they actually forced 3,200 Germans to surrender. Across northern France, the Marquis uprising started and helped the Allies. Here's a map of the Allied advance, and they helped the Allied advance by spying on German concentrations and giving them support and intelligence. Now, the Free French had an armored division in Patton's army, headed by General Leclerc. French soldiers with our equipment, etc. And they wanted to liberate Paris. On August 18th, 1944, the FFI opened up the Paris uprising. How many of you have seen the movie Is Paris Burning? Any of you ever see that movie? Watch it. It's somewhat boring, but it'll give you an idea of it is, but it'll still give you an idea of Hitler wanted Paris destroyed. If they couldn't hold it, they planted bombs, Louvre, Sacré-Cœur, all the bridges over the Seine, all of these things would be destroyed. Didn't work. Instead, on August 25th, Leclerc and the Free French division arrived with the support of the United States. The Germans surrendered. And Paris was not destroyed. On the same day, de Gaulle arrived as the president of the provisional French government. And he was hailed jubilantly at the Hôtel de Ville, that's the City Hall of Paris. And then he marched down the Champs-Élysées. There's a very famous picture of him marching down the Champs-Élysées. And thanks to his flamboyant speech, he starts the myth that the French had liberated themselves because of the national resistance of the French people to the Germans. Now, by the war's end, 400,000 people were in the resistance, and 100,000 had died. That was by the end of the war. Now, here's a plaque to honoring in the Netherlands, for the Dutch, the people who fought against the Germans. 25,000 people were active in the Dutch resistance. 102,000 Dutch Jews died at the hands of the Nazis. That is the highest percentage based on population size of any country in Europe. 550,000 people were sent to slave labor in Germany. 45,000 Dutch died who were collaborators. The Dutch had actually the highest percentage of collaboration on population size with the Germans of any country in Europe. So you see, it's very divided. September 1944, the Germans stopped the food supply. We had occupied half, the Allies had occupied half of the country, the northern half and western they had, and they were trying to starve people because of all the demonstrations and sabotage. 350,000 people were hidden by the Dutch, protecting them from the Nazis during the war. 60,000 Dutch landlords did it. And here's a picture, many of you know who it is, Anne Frank. She is a famous example of the courage shown by many Dutch. You can visit her house today in Amsterdam. Her family was discovered, and they died in a Nazi death camp. And that house, as I said, is available. Now here's a member of resistance. Her name is Miss Ruston. She helped Allied pilots escape captivity. After the war, she was renamed Audrey Hepburn Ruston. In Amsterdam, there is a museum of the resistance that my wife, Elaine, who's sitting here, and I visited. I highly recommend it to you. In Denmark, Denmark was invaded by the Germans on the 9th of April in 1940 as a stepping stone to invading Norway. The Nazis allowed the Danes basically to maintain their government for a long time, and the Danish economy supported the German war effort during that time period. However, eventually, the Danish underground began to grow because the Germans wanted control of the entire economy, and they also wanted to kill the Jews in Denmark. So acts of sabotage gradually increased. As a result of that, in August of 1943, they took over the direct control of Denmark. There were only 6,000 Jews in Denmark. Almost all of them, except for 477, were evacuated, as you see in this picture, from Denmark to Sweden by the Danes. In 1943, the Organization of Danish Freedom was organized. 1,000 acts of rail sabotage occurred. 50,000 Danes were in the resistance. 400 were executed by the Nazis. Now we turn to Norway. April 1940, the Germans invade Norway. A new government under Volcom Quisling was organized. Quisling was the turncoat Norwegian who turned his country over to the Nazis. The word Quisling became synonymous with traitor in World War II. Over 400,000 German soldiers were stationed in Norway, largely because Hitler was afraid that the Allies would invade through Norway and cut Germany off from Swedish iron ore. There were 7,000 to 8,000 Norwegians who were trained for sabotage by the British and the OSS. Norway helped to aid in the destruction of German warships, particularly the Tripitz, one of their the sister ship to the Bismarck. During World War II, this plant in Norway was sabotaged because it was a major hydroelectric plant. However, it also was used, the Nazi effort to build an atomic bomb. In 1943, a British-trained team of Norwegians attacked that structure and destroyed 18 cells that were used to produce heavy water. Allied bombing then continued, and they destroyed most of the plant. However, the Germans then decided to move the remaining heavy water to Germany. And once again, the Norwegians helped to sink the boat that carried all this heavy water. There's a movie about the heroes of Telemark that stars Kirk Douglas, and they portray what we're just talking about, it's a theatrical production, but I think you might find it interesting to watch. Now let's turn to Eastern Europe. This is a whole different world. Eastern Europe, from the beginning, had extensive and effective resistance. And why? Because the Germans promised mass homicide, mass destruction. Why? Their German racial theory. The Germans were superior. The Slavs were nothing, lice, like the Jews, to be destroyed. Subhumans. Secondly, Liebestraum, the German need to expand, to plant farmers in Poland, Ukraine, so that Germany could feed all of Europe. So even if the British had a blockade, they wouldn't be starved to death like they had in World War I. The utter brutality of the Nazi rule across Europe, Eastern Europe, sowed seeds of violent retaliation across all of that time, all of that area. Germany overran Poland, September 1939, began a systematic policy of destroying Slavic culture. Now remember, the Soviets also invaded Poland at the same time. They shot 22,000 Polish officers and others in the Katyn forest massacres, and then tried to blame the Germans for it. The Germans immediately arrested all of the intelligentsia, professors, priests, ministers. They erased the Polish state from the map, and they set up what they called a general government. 50 to 80,000 police ran Poland. Anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million German soldiers were also in Poland, partially because of the Russian front. That was the center for it. Many members of the Polish army never surrendered in 1939, and they formed the nucleus of the Home Army. There was in England, there was an exile government, and that was true for Denmark, Norway, and many of these other countries. Not for France, except for de Gaulle. So they helped to support that army. And they built a very, very elaborate resistance movement. Here is what that structure looked like. From the summer of 40, the Poles concentrated on building this remarkable underground state to help preserve Polish culture and society. 500,000 to 650,000 Poles were in the underground movement by 1944, and they committed extensive acts of sabotage. Also, there's an interesting story of this boy. Solomon Pearl was a little boy in Lutz, Poland, at that time that had been a German-speaking part of Poland. When the Germans invaded in 1939, his family was taken away. He escaped. He escaped to the Russian zone, where he was put into a Soviet orphanage. The Germans attacked June 22nd, 1941. They asked him, "Are you a Jew?" He said, "No, I'm not a Jew," because he could speak perfect German as well. The army unit that liberated the orphanage adopted him as a mascot. The movie Europa, Europa shows all of this, and there's a book. It's a true story. The soldiers liked him so much that they decided to send him to a special school for Hitler Youth in Germany. Now this whole time, of course, he was deathly afraid that he would be discovered as a Jew. By 1945, he was on the Russian front fighting in the German army now as a Hitler Youth. So when he was captured by the Russians, he said, "I'm not a Nazi, I'm a Jew, liberated from a Soviet orphanage." It's a fascinating story of survival. He was what we call a submarine. There were many Jews in Germany who, with the help of Germans, hid themselves openly. They were called submarines. There are many stories about these folks. In 1944, a major battle erupted in Warsaw. The Soviets' army was at the gates of Warsaw. You had a rising of 20,000 Polish soldiers, and they seized most of the city. What did the Russians do? They stopped. Hitler brought in reinforcements and wiped out the Poles there. Up to 300,000 Poles across Poland were then liquidated by the Germans. 90,000 put in slave labor, 60,000 sent to death camps. But Stalin achieved his purpose because the Home Army were Democrats, and he had a Polish communist government ready to take over the country when they had quote-unquote liberated it from the Nazis. So by destroying the Polish underground, he effectively helped to establish a communist government in Poland. Yugoslavia, here's a picture of Hitler with Prince Paul, who is the heir apparent to the throne of Yugoslavia. They allied themselves with the Nazis, as did the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians. Why did they do that? Well, they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Here's Hitler's Germany and here's Russia. And they were afraid of Russia. Well, there was a coup d'etat that overthrew him and ended the alliance. Hitler was so incensed, he invaded Yugoslavia with Italian and other troops on April the 6th and established, as you see, he divided the country up into bits. Some controlled by the Italians, some controlled by him. He created a special Croatian state. The Croatian state fielded 18 divisions that fought on the Russian front. There's a postage stamp with the Croatians who fought in the German army, Air Force, Navy, infantry. However, Tito, who was a communist, helped to organize effective resistance across all of Yugoslavia. Resistance started slowly but built very quickly. A civil war also started between royalists and communists, so it was a mess. And this is true in many parts of Eastern Europe, which we'll talk about in a minute. However, Yugoslavia was the only country in Europe where the partisans actually ended up controlling most of the country. The Germans maybe had the cities, but the countryside was controlled by the resistance. By 1945, 20 German divisions, about 900,000 men, were trying to fight off the resistance in Yugoslavia. And they, of course, left when the Russians arrived. Let's turn to Greece. April 6, 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. April 27th, they were occupied. Greece was divided until March of 1943 between the Germans and the Italians. Then when the Italians surrendered to the Allies and Mussolini was thrown out, the Germans occupied all of the country. Before the invasion, a civil war was starting, had been fighting across Greece between the Greek royalists and the communists. The Axis occupation only intensified this war. 60,000 partisans fought the Germans during this time, both the German and Italians. The Germans starved the Greeks to break the resistance. By 1945, the British landed troops in Greece to help the royalists to end the communist insurgency and keep Greece loyal to the West. Now we turn to Russia. June 22nd, 1941. How many of you were here last month for the Russian invasion program? Okay, a few. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 tanks and other vehicles. June 22nd, the Germans adopted a simple policy: annihilation. The crusade against the so-called Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, the quest for German Lebensraum, to resettle Germans in the East. A policy of annihilation on a grand scale, from war to death squads to even starvation. As the Germans said, we will reduce the useless mouths. And they did. 3 million were killed in Belarus alone by the Germans. That was the German, here's a poster. There's the German crusade against the hated Bolshevik hordes. In German-occupied territories, Stalin supported the partisans to attack rear areas of supply for the Germans. During the war, hundreds of thousands of Russians died as partisans. However, throughout Eastern Europe, as you can see, there was plenty of successful espionage activity that infiltrated the supply lines that supported the Russian invasion. The Germans used every device to counter this so-called terrorism, using tens of thousands of troops, firepower, euthanasia. Moral codes were absolutely abandoned. Anyone in opposition was destroyed. Priests, women, babies, slaves, Jews. 20 million Russians died. Civilians. These are not soldiers we're talking about. Most partisans were Russians or Belarus. 10%, about 20 to 30,000 of these were Jews. In Eastern Europe, the Jews fought effectively in the partisan movement. Here is pictured a famous Jewish group. Most organized around Red Army soldiers and local villages. They knew the terrain, they knew where to ambush. As the war progressed, Soviet partisans sabotaged more Germans from the Eastern Front and took more combat lives than the war itself. September of 42, 90,000 partisans were effective across the Soviet battlefield. 300,000 Germans were killed by the partisans. 3,000 bridges destroyed. 2,000 tanks. 4,000 trucks were wiped out. In 1943, now we turn to Italy. Mussolini fell in 1943 after the fall of Sicily, the invasion at Salerno. The fascist council threw Mussolini out. The King of Italy ordered him arrested. This spawned a new resistance movement across Italy. Mussolini had assumed power in the 1920s. For all that time, the communists and socialists had been brutally murdered, imprisoned, deported. They now took revenge. Italian fascists seemed as traitors to democracy, but really they were not. They really were fighting for retribution of several decades of brutality. The Italian communists and anarchists and socialists who had been persecuted now formed partisan bands, both in Italy and many other countries. And with a vengeance, and they murdered all of the collaborators they could find, and many innocent people. Civil war broke out across much of Eastern and Western Europe. An interesting other piece of that story is Hugh O'Flaherty. He was a Monsignor in the Vatican. The Vatican was neutral during the Second World War. He organized the hiding of Allied prisoners of war who had escaped Italian prisoner of war camps after the surrender of Italy. His opponent was Colonel Herbert Kepler. Between 1943 and 1944, up to 8,000 POWs were successfully hidden inside the Vatican, convents, hospitals surrounding the Roman area. After the war ended, Kepler was imprisoned for the atrocities that the SS had committed. O'Flaherty, he asked for O'Flaherty to come and see him. Over the next several years, he converted to Roman Catholicism. He died in prison. But the story of The Scarlet and the Black, which stars Gregory Peck and Christopher Plummer, I think you would find it an interesting movie to watch, and there are several books written about this. By 1945, partisan attacks on both sides of the, throughout Europe, but in Italy particularly. Here, this is Milan, and they captured Benito Mussolini. There he is, hanging by his heels and his mistress. I knew a priest who was a chaplain in the American Army. He saw this, the brutal death of these two people and other fascists. In Berlin, the German Resistance Museum tells the story of how 77,000 Germans died trying to resist Hitler's rule from 1933 to 45. There is a German Resistance Museum that I highly recommend that you can visit. Here is a stamp issued about the White Rose movement of these college students who published a newsletter and distributed it in Munich. They were both, of course, killed. This Archbishop Galen, a Cardinal of Munster, led opposition to the Nazis, specifically against euthanasia, lawlessness, and the treatment of the Jews. 7,000 Catholic priests died in Auschwitz because of their resistance and their support of these issues against the Nazis. The most important German Protestant, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he opposed Hitler. Though most of the Protestant ministers were forced into a Nazi-sponsored religious league, he opposed this. He also supported the July 1944 assassination plot to kill Hitler. He smuggled Jews into Switzerland. He was killed by the Nazis in April of 1945, shortly before the war ended. Admiral Karnassus, the head of the German intelligence service, actually was involved from 1933 to his death in 1945 in several plots to overthrow the German government. He was killed by the Nazis in 1945. In 1940, Joseph Mueller, representing the German General Staff, approached the Vatican to try to negotiate an end to the war. The German General Staff wanted to rise and arrest Hitler. This is before the invasion of France. Unfortunately, they were a little slow on the draw, and the invasion occurred and their resistance movement collapsed. However, during the 1920s to 1945, there were at least 50 attempts by various German groups and individuals to assassinate Adolf Hitler. I've done a program on this here. Have any of you attended that, maybe? Maybe I should repeat it. Okay. The best known, of course, is Valkyrie, July 1944. Count von Stauffenberg, Helmut von Moltke, principal plotters. Unfortunately, here they are. Unfortunately, the bomb, that's the room. There's Mussolini and Hitler looking. It didn't kill Hitler. In Berlin, here's the headquarters, which is now part of that Museum of Resistance. That's the courtyard where the plotters were shot. Here's the Resistance Museum in Berlin. In conclusion, how effective was the resistance? Did it really matter? Well, first, how widespread? Well, for most people, they joined in the waning days of the war, when it was obvious that the Germans were going to lose. Both SS and Wehrmacht at that time, at the end of the war, perpetrated some of the worst atrocities, trying to save themselves. And that, in turn, inflamed civilians even more. The military contribution, almost all of the sabotage from the German standpoint was insignificant, except on the Russian front. It's clear that with the exception of the East, the Germans never really were worried about the resistance movement. Only in Yugoslavia was the military could not control the resistance. And also, the Allies divided up their support of resistance groups among all these different individuals, and it didn't lead itself to effective organization of resistance across Europe. So from a moral standpoint, it helped the Jews, and it helped others to escape the Holocaust. From a moral standpoint, it gradually underpinned the hope of millions of non-Germans that they had not been abandoned and that the Allies would, in the end, liberate them. The resistance also helped thousands of downed Allied flyers to escape prisoner of war camps. 3,500 airmen were able to get back into the fight. Finally, European resistance of World War II paved the way for post-war Europe to rebuild and learn to function as a unified political system instead of the shattering appeasement that helped to bring the war about. It helped to organize NATO and the European Union. It taught the lesson that a unified Europe response to tyranny through solidarity can help deter senseless aggression and nationalist adventures. That's why today I have worn the Ukrainian colors. And that's why today I am happy that the United States and its European allies oppose Russian aggression. And we will continue to support the Ukrainians until they have absolute victory. Thank you very much.